All right, folks, I'm very, very excited for you to join us this evening. My name is William Roca. I'm the Director of Programs here at Village Preservation. Before I introduce our esteemed guest this evening, if you are unfamiliar with Village Preservation, please just spare me here a couple of minutes to let me tell you a little bit about who we are and what we do. We were founded back in 1980, and we work to preserve, celebrate, and document the special architectural, cultural, and historic heritage of Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo. We've helped secure landmark designation for more than 1,300 buildings in our neighborhoods, and we host about 80 free programs like this throughout the year. Now, your support, and especially those of our members, is absolutely critical to help do the work that we do. If you could take a moment, you can scan that QR code on your screen. You can find out a little bit more about our membership. Membership grants you early access to all of our programs, and you also have the chance to join member-only programming throughout the year. But I also highly recommend that you take a look at the website, villagepreservation.org, learn a little bit more about the advocacy work that we do, the other great programs that we have on offer. And I also highly recommend to check out our digital resources as well. We have everything from an image archive, from images donated by patrons of Village Preservation of pictures taken over the decades, but I also highly recommend you do check out our virtual maps. You can build your own walking tour, learn about all the incredible people and buildings in our neighborhood. And these are all free to use, whether you decide to become a member or not. Now, for our next program will be tomorrow evening, the 27th at 6 p.m., again here on Zoom. And it is going to be Deported from Greenwich Village, the story of Eve Adams across continents. So if you have not yet registered for that, you can head over to villagepreservation.org and register for that program. Now, just some quick housekeeping. Everyone, your cameras will be off and you will be muted throughout the evening, but that does not mean we don't want to hear from you. If you are going to have any questions during tonight's presentation, you can go ahead and pop those into the Q&A or into the chat, and they will be asked at the latter half of this evening. But now it is my great pleasure to introduce Russell Shorto, author of bestsellers Small Time, Revolution Song, Amsterdam, and I know many people's favorite, The Island at the Center of the World. He's also director of the New Amsterdam Project at New York Historical, and he's currently joining us from Maryland, and he's going to be speaking about his new book, Taking Manhattan. Mr. Shorto, it is an absolute pleasure to have you here.
Thank you very much, William Roca. Thank you, Village Preservation. Thanks to everyone for tuning in. I always prefer to do things in person, but it doesn't always work out that way. And this way, more people can tune in. So I am going to talk about my new book. I'm also going to cover some of the terrain of The Island at the Center of the World, because the two books are sort of conjoined. You could read Island and then flow right into Taking Manhattan. And I have assembled slides, so I am going to, hold on a second. I'm going to share my screen in a moment. You'd think I'd have this down by now, but no.
Well, Zoom is always changing everything.
Well, okay, I'll blame it on Zoom. Okay, can you see the, does that work?
William? Perfect.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about the new book, Taking Manhattan, which is about the moment that the English and the Dutch came almost to blows over Manhattan Island and over the whole Dutch colony of New Netherland. I will start with, well, I'll start with a lovely painting by Len Tantillo. If you don't know Len Tantillo, he is a remarkable present-day historical artist who is more meticulous in his research than I think many historians are. This is a scene of his of New Amsterdam in 1660, and I've been in his studio. He researches every building, every gable, and I think it really gives the flavor of the place. Um, uh, there was a time when historians chose to willfully neglect the Dutch colony. And this is a quote from a historian of about 100 years ago. Original sources of information concerning the early Dutch settlers of Manhattan Island are neither many nor rich. The Dutch wrote very little, and on the whole, their records are meager. Well, I always have to then introduce, even though they're not here, Charles Gehring and Janni Venema, who Charlie started in 1974 translating and then publishing the 12,000 pages of records of the Dutch colony, not to mention all the unofficial records and letters and things that people wrote. And then 10 years later, in 1984, Janni joined him, the two of them working out of the New York State Library in Albany. Janni retired several years ago, and then just this April, Charlie retired after 51 years on the job. And the work, by the way, is ongoing. And I should mention here the New Netherland Institute. So you have two organizations to become affiliated with, to become a member of: Village Preservation and the New Netherland Institute, which you can go to their website and help to support the ongoing translation publication project of these records, which are vital to understanding New York's beginnings. Okay, so as I said, the story that I told in The Island at the Center of the World was really the 40-year history of the colony of New Netherland and its capital, New Amsterdam. And that story starts with Henry Hudson. Hudson was, of all things, an Englishman who had done several voyages trying to find a short route to Asia on behalf of an English company called the Muscovy Company. For reasons we don't know, after his 1608 voyage, they let him go. And the Dutch found out about this. The Dutch knew that he was this mariner who, had a sense of the world, and they wanted to explore. And so in November of that year, he walked into this building, which still stands in Amsterdam. It was then the headquarters of the Dutch East India Company. Today, it's the administrative building of the University of Amsterdam. He met with the directors, and they hired him to go on a voyage. He was supposed to find a short route to Asia. They wanted him to go east. Instead, he went west. He had tried east, up around Russia, and he had determined that you get wrapped up in ice, and there's just no way you can get through in a small wooden vessel. So he defied those instructions and went west. And you can see here this is his 1609 voyage, where he went down the coast and then turned around and started going up. What he was looking for was a channel. They believed there was a channel that would cut through North America. They thought North America was much thinner, about a third the size that it actually is. And so they thought that he would go west on this channel. Instead of getting to Ohio or Illinois, he'd get to the Sea of Japan and be on the doorstep of these riches. So he charted this land on behalf of the Dutch East India Company. And because of that, they then laid claim to it. So then we move forward a few years. The Dutch West India Company comes into being. The East Indies, by the logic of Europeans of the day, meant Asia, everything to the east. The West Indies meant, if you're in Europe looking at a map, basically everything to your left. So coastal North America, the Caribbean, and coastal South America. So the West India Company was going to exploit the West Indies, just as the East India Company had exploited the East Indies and funneled all this wealth into this little nation. This was their headquarters, the West Indies House in Amsterdam. And it is actually, I have a personal relationship with it in that just over here in part of that edition was my office when I was director of the John Adams Institute, the American Culture Center in Amsterdam. So, and there is a cafe on the ground floor these days called, appropriately enough, Stuyvesant. So he's because of the voyage of Hudson on behalf of the Dutch laid claim to North America, and it became the province of the new West India Company. They then started a colony, which began in 1624. Just looking quickly at a map of the region from the time, so many of the features, this is just a smattering of features that have Dutch origins. Of course, the wall at Wall Street, Stuyvesant's boerderij, which became corrupted to Bowery. Boerderij is Dutch for farm. Bushwick was Boswijk. Doughtel Bay, I saw somebody's from Turtle Bay. That was originally Doughtel. Doughtel is a what do you call that? It's like a knob. I'm trying to think of the English word. It's like a stick with a knob on it. New Harlem. So it goes on and on, the Dutch naming inheritances. Ultimately, what they wanted to do, they had the idea and they learned from the native people. The Dutch were the great seafaring, trading people of the world in the 17th century. And they looked at this territory, they looked at all territory in terms of water, because water was the highway. You couldn't, I mean, if you were slogging your way through the forest, it would take forever to get somewhere. But what they knew was the river that became named after Henry Hudson. The Hudson River would go north, and then at what later became Albany, you could jog west and get all the way to the Great Lakes, and then you have access to the interior. And when you have that, then you can begin to exploit a continent. And if you jump ahead to the 1820s, what happened then was the Erie Canal was completed. That made the Mohawk River, this river, navigable the whole way. And then that vision of the early Dutch settlers began to be realized. And these cities all around the Great Lakes, Duluth and Chicago and Detroit and Erie, sprung into being. And that's the date of New York City really taking off as this kind of fulcrum between all the world's good and all the world's people and the North American continent. Okay, looking more or less at that same map from a native perspective. It was, of course, intricately peopled when Europeans came. And as complicated as this may look, this is a drastic simplification. So in the area around New York City, you have the Delaware, also called the Munsee or Lenape people. This was their native territory. Long Island was not just the Montauk. You had the Shinnecock and other peoples. Also, particularly relevant to this story are the Mohican, mostly on the east side of the Hudson River, and then the Mohawk on the west side, and then the other Haudenosaunee or Iroquois nations moving westward from there. So these are the people with whom the Dutch interacted most. And they came to trade with the native people. They came in order to do business with them. This is from Ganondagan, the state historic site in upstate New York, which is a wonderful place to visit if you've never been there. And in the back of the museum, they have a replica longhouse. Let me, a replica longhouse. And when you're inside that, I always say, you get it. You get a sense that this was a whole society. This was a whole civilization, how they lived, how one nuclear family lived next to another in an extended family, the fire pits down the middle, the holes in the roof to let the smoke escape. It gives you a sense of place. Okay, the same geography now, looking at it from the perspective of the Dutch, that orange circle more or less delineates the colony of New Netherland. The borders were never sharp, but it encompassed all or parts of Connecticut, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, some of Delaware. And you can see here these river systems. So the Hudson, the Mohawk, the Connecticut, which they called the Fresh River, and what they call the South River, otherwise the Delaware. So that's how they understood their territory. And as I said, they were trading with the native people. The native people trapped beavers and other furs and traded them for them with the Dutch. The native people were not victims, wholly victims. I mean, there was a point at which they certainly were, but they wanted something out of this relationship too. They valued European manufactured goods, knives and kettles and pots and pans and things like that. Um, the story that I tell at the center of the earlier book, The Island at the Center of the World, is built around the confrontation between Peter Stuyvesant on the left, and that may or may not be Adrian van der Donck on the right. Adrian van der Donck, Stuyvesant was the last and the most uh, uh, authoritative, the strongest of the directors of the colony. He ran it for 17 years very capably. Um, Van der Donck was appointed by the inhabitants, the residents of New Netherland, to be their spokesperson, to be kind of an opposition leader. He was the only lawyer, trained lawyer in the colony. And so the tension between them is one in which Stuyvesant is acting on behalf of the West India Company and its interests, which are all about profit, and Van der Donck seeks to act on behalf of the residents of the colony. At the height of their confrontation, Stuyvesant imprisons Van der Donck. Van der Donck, once he gets out, he goes to the Netherlands, where he leads a delegation, and he makes an appeal that the Dutch government take direct control of this colony. He argues in this book, A Description of New Netherland, that he talks about the land and its promise, and this is how many people first hear of a place called America, an island called Manhattan, and he drums up settlers. Hundreds of people go there in order to take on new lives. Quickly, some of the other colonists who are more marginal figures but important. Two here, Joris Rapalje, you see his name up in the top left, and then Katarina Trico, you see her down here. They were both Walloons, French-speaking peasants from what is now northern France or Belgium, and many of the first settlers were Walloons, and they took a chance on going to this faraway place. And so they got married, and this is the register of their betrothal in the Walloon Church in Amsterdam, which still stands. And we know that they were illiterate because they made their marks here at the bottom rather than signing their names. They would become players throughout the life of the colony. Joris lived into the 1650s. Katarina lived until the 1680s, and she was for a time probably almost certainly the oldest, longest lived resident of New Netherland and then New York. This is a 17th century Dutch painting, which I'm representing them by because among the many things they did, they ran a tavern on New Amsterdam. Dorothy Angola, I talk about a good bit in the new book, Taking Manhattan, as a way of introducing the topic of slavery. And she came probably in 1627, just a year after New Amsterdam was founded, along with a group of Africans who came, needless to say, unwillingly, and were put to work. Years later, a group of them in 1644, a group of them petitioned for their freedom and were given freedom. Dorothea and her husband among them. Her husband dies, she remarries, and later in life, they want to adopt an 18-year-old boy who had been in their care because his parents had died. And this is this fragment of the aforementioned official records of the colony is one in which Dorothea is pleading with the council to let them adopt him. Margaret Hardenbroek is a fascinating figure from the period. She arrives late in the Dutch period as a young woman. Her husband, she marries a man named Frederick Phillips. Margaret had a lot of money. Frederick had very little. He was a carpenter, and yet together they built the Phillips family fortune and the Phillips family empire in New York. And I have a feeling that Margaret or Margriet was the brains behind it because, well, there's a lot of indications of that. She was a very hands-on manager of shipping, and women had much more control over businesses and finance in the Dutch system than they did in the English. But once the colony was taken over by the English, everything had to go in her husband's name. So her presence is sort of interestingly masked by that. In sum, New Amsterdam, under the Dutch, there were, we know, famously 18 languages being spoken at one point in the 1640s. So as I like to say, New York was New York even before it was New York. The Netherlands, in Amsterdam, they meanwhile had the world's first stock exchange. That trading expertise and those trading that system of what we would call capitalism transferred with them. And it's not an accident that Wall Street delineated the northern boundary of the settlement and that Wall Street then became synonymous with finance in North America. I'll quickly go through some images from the exhibit that I put on at the New York Historical last year called New York Before New York. It's based on this map, the Costello Plan, which shows New Amsterdam. So here's the wall at Wall Street. It's a little confusing because south is actually pointing left. So you have to think of that as south. And this is the tip of Manhattan Island. Here's the wall at what became Wall Street. Here is the Dutch fort, which today, if you're in the financial district, this is the Alexander Hamilton Custom House. This was the native trail, the Wakaskek Trail, which under the Dutch became the Herenweg, the gentleman's way, and under the English became Broadway. So you can see all the 16 streets, about 300 houses here, about 1,500 residents. We had this item on loan from the Dutch National Archives in the exhibit. We know that the Dutch were very meticulous record keepers, and they negotiated something like 600 deeds with native peoples for land in the 40 years of the life of New Netherland. The most infamous, the most famous, was the purchase of Manhattan Island. That deed has been lost. Some of them survive. The deed for Staten Island, for example, survives. But what we have instead is this letter in which a Dutch official shortly afterwards wrote to his superiors saying, our people have planted their colony in the New World and they're doing well. And you can see here, he writes at Island Manhattan. He mentions the island of Manhattan, and then here he lists the pelts, the animal pelts that were on the ship. So this represents the infamous purchase. This is I think, a lovely lyrical watercolor painting of New Amsterdam right at the time of the takeover. That was made. This was made by an artist in Amsterdam. The Dutch were the great cartographers of the age, and this is a map. This map was considered the most accurate map of the Northeast for about 100 years by the English, the Dutch, the French. There were 28 different states of it made. So this is essentially the Dutch territory here, and you can see New England. They've put they used maps for propaganda to basically say, in this case, this is our territory. We're the bosses here, and the English, yeah, they're over here, kind of pushed to the side. You can see, however, that this version of the map is late. This is after the English had taken over because it says New Nederland, so it says the Dutch name, but then it says New York. So this dates from after 1664, after the English had taken it over. I put this slide here to make the point that this colony comprised really three cultures. It was a kind of confluence of three cultures. One, the African, and this basket here was found in 1981 in a dig in the financial district, and in it, it was found outside the home of Cornelis van Tienhoven, who was Peter Stuyvesant's right-hand man. And in it were found all of these objects, and that plate was on the top. This is what is called an impungu. Impungu, it means collection. This is very rare. This is one of the very few artifacts of African presence that we have in New Amsterdam. And this was a collection for healing. So you brought all these kinds of objects together in order to bring about healing of a person or of a society or of a family. The man in the middle is believed to be a Lenape or Delaware who fought against the Dutch in what was called Kieft's War in the 1640s. He was captured, and two Dutch soldiers brought him to Amsterdam and exhibited him for money. And that image is from the map that I just showed you. It's a blow up of a longhouse village, and it really gives you a sense of how these places were really, it was really a society. Okay, now that was all in a way backstory. I'm taking you now to Taking Manhattan, and many of those characters figure in this book. This book zeroes in on the moment in the late summer of 1664 when there is a standoff between the English and the Dutch, these two powerhouses in Europe. What I've been telling you up to now is the Dutch side of the story. The English, what has been going on in England? Throughout the course of the 17th century, England a conflict has been building where the Puritans, who are a religious sect, steadily gain power starting in the early part of the century, to the point where by mid-century they have control of Parliament, and they view the king, and the kings were, it was the Stuart line, the Stuart monarchy, since the king is the head of the Church of England, they view the Church of England to be corrupt and in need of purification, hence Puritans. And the king, as the head of that church, needs to be dealt with. And so finally it comes to a head, literally, when they behead the king, Charles I, which is what is being shown in this engraving from the period. And the English Civil Wars begin, and Oliver Cromwell in the center becomes Lord Protector. He rules England. And this strife then it features it breaks society down into two sides. One, the Puritans. The other are Royalists, but Royalists is a bit of a misnomer. I think it's better to say the anti-Puritans, because they weren't necessarily all people who loved the monarchy. They were just people who did not want the Puritans to come and take over and outlaw Christmas and dancing and theater, which they did. They wanted some sort of return to normalcy. So that was kind of, in one sense, what the struggle was about. Okay, so let me back up. The Stuart king, Charles I, is beheaded. His two young sons, Charles and James, flee to exile on the continent. With them comes a young man whom they have known all their lives. They grew up with. His name is Richard Nichols, and he comes from this town in Bedfordshire in England called Ampthill. I took these pictures when I was visiting with my family, and this is his tomb. He's still remembered. He's you can see the British and American flags. We all know Peter Stuyvesant. Not many Americans know Richard Nichols, but in this little village, they recognize they know him and recognize him. So what's significant about Richard Nichols is the king. When the king still had his head on his shoulders, he would take his young sons to this village, Ampthill, because it was the seat of the Royal Hunting Preserve. The keeper of the hunting preserve was Richard Nichols' father. The royal family would stay in the greatest house in the village, which was the home of the keeper. So they would literally stay, these two young princes, with this other boy, Richard Nichols. So they grew up together. Now, the Civil War breaks out. They flee. These princes flee to the continent, and Richard Nichols, along with a lot of others who are loyal to them, flee as well. This, I'm not going to work on deciphering this for you, but this is an example of, he was a spy working for them, traveling back and forth forth across the English Channel as they're machinating to get back into power. So finally, then in 1660, um, the Oliver Cromwell has died, and people in England are sick of the turmoil, and there is an invitation to the princes, to the older Charles, to become Charles II. So Charles and his brother James, the Duke of York, note the title, come back. Richard Nichols sails back across with them. They appoint him groom of the bedchamber to the Duke of York. So he's working in Whitehall Palace with them. They now want to begin to rebuild their country, and they want to build an empire. The Dutch Empire, the Dutch trading empire, has been uh, growing and doing things that have been the marvel and the envy of other European nations for most of the century. The English want to catch up, and they in particular have their sight now on the Dutch. So they're in power in London now at Whitehall Palace. They want an empire. They look across the Atlantic Ocean, and basically this is what they see. They see the English have territory in New England. They have colonies. They have territory in the South, in Maryland and Virginia. But in between is this Dutch piece, New Netherland, which has been there for 40 years. And they know that by now people understand what I was talking before about the waterways, that the Dutch have control. New England is kind of on a shelf. New Netherland controls these waterways, which get you, that form, for one thing, the boundary of New Jersey later, but they get you up and to the Great Lakes and into the interior of the continent. Plus, it controls this world-class harbor. So that's what they want. Now, so who are they going to get to go on this mission, to lead this mission? They pick Richard Nichols, who they've known all their lives. So his story, it forms kind of the spine of the book, Taking Manhattan. Nichols leads a flotilla of gunships with 450 soldiers. The ships are packed to the gills with gunpowder and weapons. He has two missions. One is to figure out how to take this colony from the Dutch. The second mission was New England, because New England, yes, was founded by the English, but these were the Puritans. These were the English who had beheaded the father of the current king. And the New England Puritans had become very powerful, and they still viewed the Stuarts as their enemy. So that was Richard Nichols' second mission, to deal with them. When he sets sail, the assumption on the part of the king and the Duke of York and their advisors is this is what's going to ensue. The Dutch and the English had fought these vicious trade wars over territory in the past, and they would do so again. So that is what they expected from him. But it's not what happened. Excuse me, one moment. What we're coming to then is a showdown in New York Harbor between the man on the right, whom we've met, Peter Stuyvesant, and on the left, there is no known image of Richard Nichols. So I picked this. He's another guy from the period, just to give you a sense. George Goring was also a colonel during the English Civil Wars. He was the same age. He had dark hair, so I'm making him stand in for Richard Nichols. So these are the two chief combatants in this standoff. Wait a second. So this then would have been the kind of map that Nichols would have had as he sailed into New York Harbor, the outer harbor past Staten Island, and this is his goal here, New Amsterdam. This map was made in the 1630s. This is a little bit more something we're accustomed to. Nichols' fleet sails he sails, the objective is to go past Staten Island and to New Amsterdam here, but he doesn't do that right away. What he does instead is he comes around and anchors in Gravesend Bay. He does that because these are all settlements in the Dutch colonies. So New Amsterdam is the capital. Breukelen is another Dutch village. So is Vlissingen, which became Flushing. So is Vlakkerbos, which became Flatbush. So is New Amersfoort. And so is Gravesend. The different thing about Gravesend is it was founded within the Dutch colony by mostly English residents. Richard Nicolls had done his homework when he was in London. He had interviewed people who lived in the colony, English people who knew, who had worked with Stuyvesant. So he knew a great deal. So he anchors there, and what he does is he begins to send messengers on a boat to New Amsterdam. Stuyvesant reads it, Stuyvesant sends a message back. And this 2-week period is the heart of the story that I tell in this book. To me, it's a fascinating story because it's one in which both of these leaders expect that they're going to come to blows, but instead they do something different. The reason they do, from Nicolls' perspective, is, as I say, he has done his homework and he has learned that the Dutch have created something quite wonderful in New Amsterdam. They have this powerhouse little trading port that trades with people in the Caribbean, in South America, in Europe. He wants that system. So I talked about the Dutch pioneering capitalism and the Dutch having this multi-ethnic society built on this notion of tolerance or religious toleration. So that's what intrigues Richard Nicolls. And if he bombs away at New Amsterdam, he'll have the island of Manhattan, but then he will just start over. So he decides what he wants is New Amsterdam itself. He wants the people, he wants the secret sauce that they have, because, these things like a multi-ethnic society, people speaking different languages and somehow all cohering, that was counterintuitive to people at the time. So he's intrigued by it. He doesn't quite get it, but he wants them to stay. So what he wants to do is to make them an offer that they can't refuse. From the Dutch side, from Peter Stuyvesant's side, and the side of his settlers, they have tried for years to get the Dutch West India Company to support them. Stuyvesant has written letters saying, we sit beside this, and before him, Vanderdonk was doing that as well, saying we're sitting on the edge of this vast continent. We have this choice real estate. We've got this harbor. We can exploit it, but you need to send soldiers. You need to send settlers. Otherwise, the English are going to come and take it. So they saw that was the danger. By now, years have gone by, and they have not gotten that support. So, Stuyvesant ultimately decides he has the way I read it, Stuyvesant had a loyalty to the West India Company. He was an employee of theirs. He had a loyalty to the Dutch government, but he also had a loyalty to this place. He had lived there 17 years. He believed that he was the instrumental figure in building up this society, and he and his wife Judith had raised their children there. So ultimately, he decides that loyalty trumps the other ones. And then finally, what they agree on, these settlers, you can see these negotiators, and you can see their names at the bottom of the document on the English side and on the Dutch side. They negotiate what is sometimes called articles of surrender. But really, if you read, and this is available online, and I have the whole thing in the book, this is a Bill of Rights. The inhabitants the English promise that if Stuyvesant and if the Dutch will hand it over into English control, the Dutch will keep their homes, they'll keep their lands, they'll keep their families, they'll keep their trading networks. By all means, they want Dutch vessels to keep coming in and out. They will keep their liberty of consciences, their religious freedom. So ultimately, then, that's what happens. And okay, so that happens at the end of this 2 weeks. Richard Nicolls then marches in, takes over from Stuyvesant. Meanwhile, eventually, word gets back to Europe, to The Hague, where and this is, I put this slide in here because these amazing little coincidences and the fact that we have a record of that moment to me is just wonderful. When word gets back, um, the Dutch leader, Johan de Witt, is actually in a meeting with George Downing, the English ambassador to The Hague. And the directors of the West India Company had rushed there to tell their prime minister the news that they've lost this colony. And they scribbled this note to him, which says, noticing that you are in conversation with Lord Downing, we thought that you should know that New Netherland has been conquered by the English and New Amsterdam has been renamed New York. So this is actually, it's like having a little snapshot of that moment. Okay, so Richard Nicolls takes over. He has this fancy map, which is really kind of a trophy suitable for framing, made and sent to James, the Duke of York, to hang on his wall. He also commissions this much more usable map of Manhattan, which I think is lovely because it shows the original inlets and curves and twists and turns of the island. Nicolls becomes the first governor of New York. He is the one who you see down here, this pink, that was New Amsterdam. Nicolls decides, you know what? We're going to make the island of Manhattan New York. That will be New York. So Nicolls, in so many ways, in this 4 years in which he is in control, sets the tone, sets the trajectory of New York and what it would become. So what happens in 1664? That's James, the Duke of York, dressed as Mars, the god of war, and looking kind of like Robert Plant, I think. New Amsterdam becomes New York. Beverwijk becomes Albany. A lot of places stay the same, or the names don't change that much. Harlem, Brooklyn, Staten Island, Long Island. And what I argue in the book this is really the invention of New York. The negotiation that these people on the ground, the Dutch and the English, achieved in that summer of 1664 allowed Dutchness, allowed these Dutch features, capitalism, tolerance, to become cemented into the fabric of New York City at a moment when then it would become come under English control, and that was a crucial moment because the Dutch Empire was starting to wane, whereas the English Empire was only growing in power. So New York then rises with it. Remember, I mentioned Nicolls' other mission to deal with the Puritans in New England. He totally failed at that. The Puritans, based in Boston, were too strong. They were too powerful, and they knew that the King, Charles II, had too much on his plate. And so they were minting their own money. They were defying the Stuart government. And what that does, I think, Nicolls' success in dealing with the Dutch colony and his utter failure in dealing with Puritan New England sets up what I would call competing ideologies throughout American history. And this, I'll leave you with this note. Have we this inherited trauma that goes all the way back to those two missions of Richard Nicolls, where we set up this one ideological power center, New England, as a monoculture, as religion-based, as Christian, as America first, and this other, New York, as diverse, secular, globally minded, tolerant, and geography. These kinds of ideologies don't stay fixed to a geography. When I've given talks for the book in Boston, I was at Harvard Bookstore and I said, "How many Puritans are here?" There were no Puritans. But nevertheless, I think that the grip of those ideologies is something that has remained part of our inheritance. I will leave you there with a kind of before and after image of New Amsterdam, and I am happy to take questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So yeah, folks, please pop your questions into the chat or Q&A feature. But I'll ask a couple of my own questions and then we'll prioritize audience. One question I have is what role were the indigenous people playing at this point of time? Because I was reading in the book and I was actually very surprised by it that even today, New York City has the largest Native American population within the United States. So it's still an integral part of our city's culture today. What role were they playing at that time? Were they making alliances with the English versus the Dutch, or the Dutch versus the English?
Yeah, it's a as you can imagine, it's a huge topic. As I showed from that one map, it's very complicated because there were so many different tribes and nations, and they oriented differently. The Haudenosaunee up in the north were quite powerful. They were also very cohesive. The Seneca from the Seneca in the west to the Mohawk in the east, they worked together, and they kept, as a result, they kept power. Um, the Lenape or Munsee, the people around New York City, they organized mostly at the village level. They didn't pool together in quite the same way. So the dynamics, the Dutch, and again, by Dutch, I mean this mixed European community, dealt with them differently and had to. They had to learn different languages, and the native people had to learn Dutch. It was a business relationship. What we learn about most often, which understandably is the violence. There were periods of hideous violence that broke out. There were massacres. Um, but I think that the main thing to keep in mind, which is really hard to do, is the fact that from the moment Europeans arrived, they brought with them diseases that the native people had no immunity to, and something like 90% or maybe more than that of people died from these illnesses. So that kind of loss of population becomes this huge, it really skews the balance of power.
And kind of just my own little curiosity, because I live in the very far north of Manhattan in Inwood, and there's a
Mhm.
memorial up here for the selling of Manhattan, but I also believe there's one at the very south of Manhattan. Was there, I mean, did that event in itself actually occur? Was there like a ceremony for the purchase of Manhattan? And do we have any idea of where it took place?
Yeah, there surely would have been a ceremony because that's how the native people did things. I kind of glossed over that because there was a lot of ground to cover, but um, there was a deed, even though it's been lost. There was a deed because the Dutch always got deeds, and we have a record of it. Um, and the Dutch knew perfectly well that the native people did not have a notion of real estate transfer. They knew that from the native perspective, they would have been entering into an alliance, saying, we're going to continue to be here. You're allowed to come and live here, and we'll do business with one another. And if one of us is attacked, we'll help the other. Okay, now, and so everybody knows the infamous $24 purchase. That $24 was actually referred to in the letter that I showed earlier. 60 guilders worth of goods was not a purchase. That was a gift. It was a token, and you would give these gifts at a ceremony. The ceremony would be um, and it would go on for a couple of days. Everybody who wanted to speak would speak. I mean, there's a lot of Adrian van der Donk wrote at length about how these ceremonies unfolded. Um, in Inwood, yeah, I think the reason for there being a marker in Inwood is that they found a native, they excavated a native settlement there, and someone decided, well, this must be where that happened. There is no logic to that because New Amsterdam, the southern tip of the island, that was the business end. That's where New Amsterdam was. That's where the Dutch were. That had been the crossroads when it was before the Europeans came. Native people, the Lenape, the Shinnecock, others in the area would go around there through New York Harbor. So logically, it seems to me that's where it would have been.
Thank you. All right, we got a number of questions here. Here's a fun one. Are the Knicks and Mets colors in fact Dutch orange and blue?
Yeah, that goes back to New York, a moment of New York's pride in its Dutch beginnings, and at that time the Dutch flag was blue, orange, and white, and so that is directly a link,
Oh, very cool.
well, indirectly a link.
And then we have, what was the role or impact of the Treaty of Breda on the situation in New York?
So that's the treaty. So what I talked about is 1664, the moment of the English taking over in inventing New York. That set off the Second Anglo-Dutch War. There had been one before, and there would be others after. A trade war, and these were, these two European colonial powers, and they're grabbing pieces of one another's uh, property, so-called, in West Africa and in South America, whatever. And the way these always ended was when you were exhausted from fighting, negotiators came and sat down. And in 1667, they sat down in Breda, the city in the southern Netherlands, and they negotiated this treaty. People often think that there was a one-to-one swap between in this negotiation between New York and either Suriname in South America or a little island called Run in the East Indies, which was prized for spices. Neither of those things is true. What they did in the negotiations was they had all these properties that they had stolen from one another, never mind that they had stolen them from the people who lived there. And so they typically what they did is they swapped back. But in this case, there is a Latin term that I'm forgetting, but it means keep it as it is. So because of that, the English kept New York, and people in the Dutch colony were surprised. I quote a letter in the book from one Dutch resident who says, "Well, this is 3 years after it became New York." He says, "Well, now I guess we're going to have to learn English," because they had been just waiting for the treaty to come and it would become Dutch again.
And then we have a question here. Why didn't the Dutch West India Company support the colony New Netherland more?
Yeah, they were trying. They had a lot. Uh, Let me back up. The Dutch East India Company made a lot of money relatively easy in Asia. That is an it was an easier, they were easier commodities to deal with. They were lightweight, spices and things like that. A bag of pepper you could like buy a house with. The West India Company, you were dealing with things like wood and sugar and the geography was quite different. They had a really hard time and then New Netherland itself, and this is the story that I tell in the island at center of the world, the inhabitants put up a fuss and they said, we want to be treated like a province uh, of the Dutch Republic. So they were trying to throw off West India Company rules. So they were very ornery, and that forced the West India Company to break its monopoly on trade, and in particular on the fur trade. So the West India Company was not making money, and it never made money out of New Netherland. Whereas, because people had exerted their will and they broke down this monopoly, individual traders were making money. And that explains why in 1664 you have all these powerful individual traders behind Stuyvesant saying, the hell with the Dutch West India Company. We'll make a go of it under the English.
Let's see. Can you talk about the female Montauk chief who tried to warn Peter Stuyvesant about the approach of the English ships who were planning to take over New Amsterdam?
Yeah. Again, the native peoples were constantly trying to work their own alliances, and there are many indications in the records that they found that they were content doing business with the Dutch. So people on Long Island were ready to ally themselves with the Dutch. But in this case, so in this case, they said, hey, we've got information for you. And Stuyvesant, we don't know why, but he chose not to believe it. I opened the book by talking about what Stuyvesant was involved with just at the moment the English ships were about to arrive. He got called north to deal with a problem in Beverwijk, later Albany, the second city of the colony. And then he comes back, and I think you don't know. I mean, Leo Hershkowitz, the historian, once said to me, the frustrating thing about historical records is people don't say why. They just say what they're doing or who they're doing it with or whatever. So we don't know why he chose not to believe her, but there's probably a lot of history that turned on that.
And what do you see as the role of the Dutch Reformed Church, which dominates Upper Manhattan regarding African Americans, which seem to have separate cemeteries and schooling with strict insistence on literacy? Pink, Pinkster African Pentecost is now being celebrated at the Dykeman House.
Okay, so that I'm going to interpret that as a question about the role of the Dutch Reformed Church in general, and broadly speaking, and I was talking about in England the English society in the course of the 17th century divided into the Puritans and the more moderate party. Something similar was going on in the Netherlands, not quite as violently, but you had the ultra-Orthodox party, and then you had the tolerant party, who were called the Remonstrants. And they were both technically the Dutch Reformed Church, but one, over the course of the century, one or the other held sway. And so what happened in New Netherland, depended on who was in favor in the home country, which side, the Orthodox or the more liberal or tolerant. Overall, though, in New Netherland, the Dutch language persisted, Dutchness persisted. Of course, I talked about things like capitalism and relative tolerance. As things that persisted and became part of the New York landscape. And indeed, the Dutch Reformed Church did as well. And Pinkster's a holiday that particularly became part of and associated with African Americans. And like the language, these traditions held on longer up the Hudson River in the Hudson Valley than they did in New York City.
See, okay, did the Dutch first settlers have a particular law that carried over into English control, or when it was taken over by England, that permitted them to acquire and maintain their great wealth for the centuries after the handover?
Well, what that question speaks to is the position of these settlers at the time, and the so-called Articles of Surrender, this Bill of Rights, that they negotiated, that they would keep their property. And just as one example, Cornelis Steenwijk had been a burgemeester, a mayor of New Amsterdam, and a couple of years after the English takeover, he became a mayor of New York. So he kind of personifies that, this population of people who survived, who were doing well in the Dutch period and continued to do well in the English period.
In the interest of time, then I'll make this our final question. And I'm just seeing everyone's comments they're absolutely loving the presentation and I think are super excited to read the book. One person compares you to the historian Barbara Tuchman and all her wonderful books, which I actually second because your books are awesome. But we have here, is 1624 now on the New York City seal, etc., the appropriate date for the founding of our city?
I believe 1625 is on the seal. 1624 is when, I mean, there are arguments to be made for 1624 as the founding, 1625, and 1626. You take your pick. So I have a center at the New York Historical, and we're doing programming. We had this exhibit that I showed slides of last year because that was the 400th anniversary of first settlers coming, so the founding of the colony. 1625, I think, is actually a lesser logic to that as the 400th anniversary this year, 2025. Um, 1626 is, as I showed in the Skagen letter, when they purchased the island and New Amsterdam is founded. So you could say 24 is the colony and 26 is the city of New Amsterdam and of New York.
Well, it seems very New York. What we always say, it's like it's so great they named it twice, so now we get to have 3 birthdays if we want as well.
Yeah, well, I just want to thank you again, William. Thank you all very much, and I'm happy to. Can I download any other questions? And I'm happy to. I mean, can
Yes,
I just take them off of the? Okay, or
I'm
maybe you can send them to me.
absolutely.
And
I'm
anybody
happy.
wants to write me on my website, russellshorto.com. I'm happy to chat. So thanks very much for being so interested. And I see Jeff Jarvis on there. Jeff Jarvis, great journalist, holding up the standards through difficult times. Thank you all very much.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for sharing your absolutely encyclopedic knowledge and also just making it understandable for us and just sharing how absolutely fascinating it is. So, Russell Shorto, thank you so much. Please go out and buy Mr. Shorto's book, Taking Manhattan. I've been enjoying reading it so far, and I know you will too. Thank you to our wonderful audience and all of your great questions. So I'm wishing you all a very great evening. Mr. Shorto, another big thank you.
Bye bye, everyone.
Have a good night.